of the original nature, they could not avoid divisions in theology and disputes among philosophies arising from the newfound freedom of faith and thought. The Renaissance and Reformation together had successfully undermined the authority of the medieval church. Now, in that free environment, in new interpretations of the Bible, differing philosophies, and contrasting perspectives, reflecting these two views of life, arose and came into conflict. As we see this development, we can see that Cain-type and Abel-type views of life developed during this period. Let's consider the Cain-type, more external and worldly view that arose out of the Renaissance. The pursuit of the external aspects of the original nature, as we've discussed, first aroused a movement to revive ancient Hellenism and gave birth to the humanism that was expressed in the Renaissance. Renaissance humanism opposed medieval culture and sought to establish a new perspective on life. The beauty of life in the world, the glory of nature, the dignity of man, etc., turning away from traditional church dogma. As a result, the Renaissance elevated the dignity of the human beings and the value of nature. It sought to understand these through reason and experience, logic and experiment. Spurred by the progress of natural science, this perspective, this view of life gave rise to two schools of modern philosophy: rationalism, based on the deductive method, and empiricism, based on the inductive method. Let's consider these two. First of all, rationalism, based on reason and logic. Rationalism is based on the mind's capacity to deduce truth through logic. An example of deductive logic would be this. Statement A, all men have noses. Statement B, Reverend Shanker is a man. Therefore, statement C would be the logical deduction that Reverend Shanker has a nose. Now, there's certainly nothing wrong with this method of logic. We've been using it throughout our lecture series. But the rationalists were dogmatic and absolute about the fact that this was the only way that truth could be ascertained and verified. They were reacting against the tradition and dogma and doctrine of the church, saying the only way you can know truth is what your mind can deduce. René Descartes was an early champion of rationalism. And so it was extreme in this sense. And Descartes, for example, said, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Which really means this. I can doubt anything. I can doubt that this camera in front of me exists. I can doubt that this studio around me exists, or the board behind me exists. I can doubt everything except one thing, that I am aware that I'm doubting. So I know I'm thinking, so I know I exist. And this rather complicated process of logical deduction became the basis of modern philosophy. Deductive logic is the basis of modern philosophy. And in their extremes, in its extreme, it tended to denigrate and deny tradition, dogma, and doctrine, preferring to rely only on the power of the human mind to deduce truth. Now let's consider empiricism, the second view. It's based on inductive reasoning, and that's the power of the mind to experience. The mind is a tabula rasa, a blank slate, and the only things that we can determine as true are the things we've experienced based on our interaction with the environment and our sense experiences. Now, an example of inductive logic would be this. There's a man, and he has a nose. Well, there's another man. He has a nose. Man number 3 has a nose. Eventually, I come to the conclusion that all men have noses. Based on what? Experiment and experience. Now, obviously, inductive reasoning is the basis of modern science and experimentation. And its early champions were men like Francis Bacon and John Locke. Now, there's certainly nothing wrong with examples and experience to prove a point. We've been doing that from the beginning of our lecture series. But in the extreme, the empiricists were reacting against the mysticism of the church and its spiritual authority. And so they tended to denigrate anything that was not ascertained by the mind's own experience. sense impressions. So they tended to deny revelation, mystical experiences, intuition and inspiration and insight. And anything that couldn't be ascertained by experience was not important. So God became not so important. Spirituality became not so important because it couldn't be experienced by the senses. Now, the Renaissance launched these two currents of thought which were rooted in humanism. So as a result, instead of facilitating the internal inclination to see God, this gave birth to a view of life that encouraged people to follow only more worldly, material, external, sensory pursuits. Therefore, this blocked their path to God, led them toward a more materialistic, external, and ultimately self-centered existence in the realm dominated by Satan. For this reason, we refer to it as a Cain-type view of life. Now, this Cain-type view broke down the truths that were enshrined by history, tradition, and church authority. People's energies now were more narrowly directed toward the good life, life in the world, and improving it and experiencing it, toward the practical life. This basic perspective was the ideology of the Enlightenment, which developed out of these two trends of empiricism and rationalism. The Enlightenment was a burst of new philosophical insight based on the human mind's ability to deduce truth, centered on the human capacity to figure out the truth all by ourselves. Some examples of Enlightenment philosophy would be atheism. If I can figure out everything by science, and if it's all based on what I experience and my logic, then I don't need God to explain the mysteries of life. But also deism, which from Lord Herbert in England and others, which recognized that obviously this magnificent universe had to have been designed and created. But whoever did that must be gone, because there's no personal God interacting with human life or history. Another example was materialism, another Enlightenment philosophy. Men like Ludwig Feuerbach. Man is nothing more than an animal, descended from an evolutionary process. And all of his thinking and inspirations and ideas and joy and laughter are just electrochemical impulses in the brain. And our memories and our beliefs are just our interaction with our external environment. Man is nothing more than an animal, and anything spiritual is a product of matter. Now, arising out of this perspective came a number of other philosophical movements that led ultimately right into the 20th century. For example, existentialism. If we are the product of evolution, life is an accident. If there's no transcendent ideals and no God, then life has no meaning other than the meaning you give it. So embrace the world, enjoy life, have a tremendous experience, for you are the one who determines its value and worth. Now, that influenced many artists and writers like Hemingway and Faulkner and others in the Western world. But ultimately it led to despair and confusion and spiritual crisis in the lives of many of its strongest proponents. Out of materialism, the movements in psychology were impacted. Men like Freud, who said we are animals, and it's our animal impulses that really define who we are under the thin veneer of culture and civilization. Skinner and behavioralism said that human beings can be taught to act and react by stimulus and response in the same way as you would train an animal, because after all, human beings are only animals. Now, in the political sphere, the Cain-type view of life, which budded after the Renaissance and grew through the Enlightenment into atheism and materialism, matured into the godless ideology of Marxist communism. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels took the materialism of Feuerbach and took an idealistic philosopher's from George Hegel, the idea of the dialectic, and turned it on its head, developed a philosophy that justified violent revolution and class struggle, and denied the spirituality of human beings, and saw God and religion as a tool of the rich to oppress the lower classes. and made the foundation for the development of Marxism and communism. Now, let's consider the development of the Abel-type view of life during this period. In fact, the original nature not only pursues external values, it also seeks internal values. Many modernists have made the mistake of believing that science and philosophy and technology are determining the modern world, and religion belongs in the past, the era of mysticism and superstition and dogma and blind belief to answer questions we couldn't figure out. And now that we have science and modernism, we don't need those antiquated belief systems. But in fact, we'll see that this period included also many spiritual renewals and a second reformation and a great awakening, and that there's an irrepressible desire in human beings, in modern human beings, to understand the meaning and value and purpose of life, which can't be answered by science. Science can only tell us how. It can never tell us why. Marx was convinced that the development of science would eventually put religion in the dustbin, in the garbage can of history, as science would show all the answers to all the external problems and a perfect material universe. But in fact, 20th century science undermined Marx's materialistic view. Einstein's theory of relativity and quantum mechanics and the awareness of geneticists that every human being living on Earth is related, has a common ancestry, and the Big Bang Theory and its metaphysical suggestions, what it suggests metaphysically about life, all of these lend themselves to a more spiritual view and more harmony between science and religion. Einstein felt it was impossible to look at the elegance and the order and the beauty of the universe and not recognize the hand of a creator. Einstein felt that science was a surer path to God than religion. So let's look at how this internal, more Abel-type view of life developed in this modern era. As medieval people were prompted by their original nature to pursue internal values, a movement arose to revive Hebraism, which, as we've learned, bore fruit in the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation spawned a variety of dogmas, doctrines, interpretations, denominations, religious teachings, and philosophies which developed a multi-dimensional view of life, all of them seeking to realize the God-given original nature of human beings. So we call this the Abel-type view of life, because even as the Cain view was leading people away from God and faith and toward a more humanistic fulfillment in the world, this Abel-type view guided modern people to seek God in a deeper and more thoughtful way, to seek for a more genuine faith, a truer understanding of the truth, and a more personal experience with a living God. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant pioneered this Abel-type view of life in the philosophical sphere. Kant, in his critique of pure reason, analyzed and showed that we cannot limit the definition of a human being to merely what we experience with our senses or what we can deduce with our intellect and logic, that there are profound inner aspects, moral and spiritual, that define us and that go beyond these definitions, and that to deny them denigrates the human being. Kant laid the foundation for the German idealistic school. He was succeeded by a number of idealistic philosophers, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, and others. All of them affirmed that the teleological view of the universe, that life seems to be purposeful, that there's direction and purpose and order, and they all recognize that human history is moving in a direction, guided by an absolute spirit. Their idealistic perspective, which said that idea and value and purpose was first, and material followed, it laid the foundation for affirming the existence of God and the spirituality of the human being. Now, likewise, in the religious sphere, there were religious movements emerging which opposed the prevailing influence of rationalism and church authority and dogma in religion, and instead stressed the personal believer's experience with God, the importance of religious zeal and the inner life. These were movements like Pietism in Germany, Methodism, and the Quakers. They all emphasized the inner life. They all emphasized having a mystical, personal, spiritual encounter, meeting God, meeting the Holy Spirit. In the meantime, the Great Awakening roared through Europe and America, where preachers would hold huge tent meetings, revival meetings, and believers would come and have a powerful spiritual experience with the Holy Spirit, with the living God, led by people like George Whitefield from England or Jonathan Edwards from the United States. Now, at the same time, as this Abel-type view of life was maturing, it laid the basis for forming the democratic world of today. Now, let's be clear. Democracy would not have developed without the Enlightenment ideals of the value of the human being, justice and rights, and the responsibility of government and so many other aspects. But any effort to create a democratic government that failed to recognize the spirituality of man, to allow the freedom of worship and honor that aspect, in every case ended in despotism and totalitarianism and oppression. So the foundation of modern democracy was a beautiful marriage between Enlightenment ideals and the Christian spirit. This is that second period that developed these divergent philosophies and views of life. Let's now look at the third period of maturation of politics, economy, and ideology, from 1789, the French Revolution, until 1918, the end of World War I. At the outset of this new period, which we call the period of maturation, where there was the development of ideological movements that hardened into political and economic systems reflecting these two views of life. These two views matured, taking their separate paths as we see them developing into hardened political and economic systems. As they matured, they founded two different forms of society with distinct social structures, a Cain-type society and an Abel-type society. This period lasted from the French Revolution through the Industrial Revolution to the end of the First World War. These two views established a Cain-type and an Abel-type of democracy, which eventually matured into the communist world and the democratic world, which confronted each other throughout the 20th century. Let's first consider the rise of Cain-type democracy. Those espousing a Cain-type view of life championed the French Revolution, thus establishing Cain-type democracy. It blocked the inclination of the human spirit to seek for God. The leading thinkers behind the French Revolution, men like Diderot, D'Alembert, Rousseau, and Marat, they adhered to atheism and materialism. They stirred the resentment of the working class people against not only the state, but also the church and religion. They saw the religious leaders as a tool of oppression. And so an excessively bloody and violent and riotous revolution took place in which many of the political and religious leaders were put to death without due process. Because of this spirit, despite its ideals, the French Revolution's actual course tended toward totalitarianism. Once the revolution was complete, the revolutionaries began to turn on each other. Counter-revolution followed counter-revolution. Thousands were put to the guillotine and beheaded in the name of being enemies of the people. And soon it depended on whose political alliance that you were part of, whether you survived or not. Ultimately, this bloody process and the reign of terror where heads rolled, if you've heard that saying, it comes from the French Revolution. Ultimately, it ended in a more severe dictatorship under Napoleon than the government that they had tried to overthrow in the first place. And this is the model of virtually every Marxist revolution that followed in the succeeding centuries. So as it continued to develop with its sole focus on the external aspect of life, this Cain-type democracy would later be systematized into Marxism in Germany, Leninism in Russia, and eventually forming the communist world. Marx provided the ideological and philosophical foundation to justify revolution. But his idea would have ended in a bookshelf if it wasn't for Lenin, who provided the practical techniques for fomenting revolution within society. And this is the foundation for Cain-type democracy. Now, let's consider the rise of Abel-type democracy. From their very origins, the democracies which emerged in England and the United States were different from the democracy born out of the French Revolution. The English and American democracies were founded by genuine and sincere Christians, the fruit of the Able type view of life. And they were born out of the fight to win religious freedom. Hence, they are Able type democracies. Now, these efforts, these movements, the first two efforts to make a revolution in Europe, the Puritan Revolution and the Glorious Revolution, both of them were not against the church, but they sought to establish and maintain the ideals of Christianity, even while seeking representative government and political rights for all. Now, both of these efforts at creating a Christian democracy fell short. But out of them, eventually arose a third that happened in America, the American Revolution. And here in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, you can see the transcendent ideal, the God-centered perspective that became the foundation for American democracy. We hold these truths to be self-evident, meaning universal and apparent to everyone, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed not by the state or by the government, but by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. What a revolutionary concept. That the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. And that the purpose of government is to secure and protect God-given rights. This was the foundation of Able-type democracy. Many Puritans and dissenting Christians who had been persecuted in England emigrated, crossed the ocean to the American continent to obtain religious freedom. They became pilgrims for their faith. As they crossed, they saw themselves in the position of the Israelites wandering through the desert, seeking for the promised land. Now, many different kinds of people came to America, but America's political and spiritual tradition came from this root and this core. And the Founding Fathers inherited that foundation. They founded an independent nation in 1776 and established American democracy. This Able type of democracy has developed from these beginnings into the democratic world of today. Now, make no mistake, these founders were flawed, and the system they created fell short in many ways, but there was no greater sin than the fact that the American political tradition allowed and justified slavery and inequality. The fact that though the Declaration of Independence had said all are created equal,